Hello. Let me get rid of this. It's me, your favorite pastry-based life form. Oh, been a while. Let me move. No, that's not me. Where's me? Here's me. Move me down a bit. Move the clothes down a bit. There we go. There we go. So many things to do. So little time to do it. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome from a reading stream. I'm reading my book that I wrote over the last two NaNoWriMos on stream as a as a way of getting through it. Hey Paul, how's it going? How's it going? I have no idea what sounds like right now. I moved my mic about 4 different times, and I don't know what's going on with the sound. Anyway, um, so far we've died to an accident with a keyboard in a PC cafe. Thank you for the audio. Check thing. I don't know, words. I hope you're feeling better soon, because it sucks when it's just sucking. And feel free to hang out and listen to this weird ass story that we're up to chapter 20 at the moment. It's super cold here too, and dark. It's like the 10 o'clock went back, and then immediately it was like, yes, it shall be dark at 6 p.m. It shall feel dark at like 4 p.m. Halloween was pretty busy. We had a lot of little kids turn up, to the point like we had like lollipops to hand out, um, just because of the variety bag that we bought, and I was like, I can't ethically give you this lollipop. Too little. So I had to find some Christmas chocolate that we didn't hand that out instead. Yeah, shocking hazard, because sometimes the lollipop bit comes off, and then chucking. But like literally, one of them was about like was under 1 year old and was dressed as a skeleton, and I was like, this is the cutest. And they were like, happy, like the way they said Halloween was so cute. They were like, happy Halloween. And I was like, oh. And then everything was done by like 8 p.m. Like where we used to live, we used to get lots of teenagers. And it was like mostly girls dressed as witches as well. There was like very few boys. There was a boy dressed up in a blow up chicken costume, and he dropped his thing of sweets, and then it was like to his friends, he was like, I can't pick it up. Someone help me pick it up. And then as he was walking, it was just like crinkle, 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 crinkle. I thought that was very funny. I was dressed as me. The worst thing it could be. No, I was just in I don't remember what I was wearing. I was wearing the same trousers I have on right now, and a different shirt. Because the shirt I had on yesterday, I had I put it on to throw away a fridge. So it was the worst because it smelled so bad, and I'm the only one that can lift it. So shoving it in the car so it can go to the tip was an experience. I also need to update the moon goal, but I'll do that tomorrow because that requires maths. Yeah, I was throwing away a dishwasher. My sister had to help me with that, and a fridge yesterday. So today. This is how my brain doesn't work. Don't know what day it is. Don't know what time it is. Don't know where I am. It's not my fault. I ate Halloween sweets and uh, we had a lot of like hard boiled sweets left over because I wasn't going to give them to babies, but that just means I can eat. Yeah, it's like what's it called in America? I don't know. There's like this stuff lollipops are made out of. I probably should be like boiled sweets. I don't know why I said hard boiled. It's a new thing. But it's just like the like hard sugar, flavored sugar type of sweet. This is what happens when I'm tired and full of sugar. I mean, people used to egg people's houses that didn't give them sweets. So I didn't put the warning, the content warning in. Let me do that now. Sorry, forget. My old goal. Bad people do bad things. Medical inaccuracy. And what do you call it? Medical inaccuracy and we'll just put ableism because that's what it is. Ableism. ACT. Please look after yourself. The problem with reading this is that I've forgotten everything that's written in it that I wrote for this story and when it happens. There we go. Like I'm editing like in the chapters that are in like the 50s and this is chapter 20, so just mind wiped. Here's the thing, I haven't written anything for NaNoWriMo yet because I'm starting a new story and I'm looking at the page and I'm just like, no. And I had to throw a fridge away and put together a bookcase. That nothing nothing respects NaNoWriMo. But you do fully get in a trance. Last NaNoWriMo, I wrote 10,000 words in one day because I had to because it was the last day. You went from 40k to 50k. Go get that food. Feel free to turn up and leave whenever you feel like. We don't hold hostages here. I mean, I feel like I could have done it one day. I have a habit of getting ahead, and then I took took that drink purely so that I could take this medicine, and I forgot to take the medicine. Well, I love how I forget every time. Anyway, I will enjoy the sweets and the book. Like I said, feel free to pop in that one if you want to. We don't hold people hostage here, if you can help it. We're going to start again from chapter 20 because I finished chapter 20 last Wednesday, but I was also 95% asleep when I was doing it, so no doubt it sounds terrible. So we'll start again from here. Also, it's a kind of like, hello, here's the story. Let's start. Chapter 20, concerning memory loss. Or concerning memory loss. The weak god's memory loss. Yeah, don't go there. The weak god's memory loss. It's totally fine. Don't panic. The weak god's memory loss was very worrying. This is how we find out that Mario's actually a bot. Oh, after all this time, I found out the truth. The weak god's memory loss was very worrying. It wasn't unheard of for a human to lose memories after a traumatic, almost fatal injury, but it was a phenomenon that had yet to be observed among even the weakest of the gods. After doing several very extensive tests, here we go, it's the first tongue twister of the night. Very extensive tests on Dethos, the team of healing deities in the halls of healing were gathered together to discuss his lack of memory. Gathering together like this would hopefully help them get to the root of the problem faster. They tested for every physical thing that could be wrong with him. None of the organs that stored his godly powers were damaged. Author's note. Personally, I keep my godlike powers in my magical pancreas. It's exactly like my non-magical pancreas, only it's actually good for its job. If you don't know, diabetic. In fact, they were working amazingly well, considering how low his power level was right now. Despite this, though, the wounds that crisscrossed Dethos's body were still taking longer to heal than any of them would have predicted. The longer Dethos stayed in the healing halls, the higher their concern about his memory loss grew. At one point, they had even resorted to doing a sort of identity parade to determine the severity of the memory loss. It had consisted of pretty much any heavenly being that had ever interacted with Dethos that was still alive visiting him in the healing halls. That plan of action, however, was to no avail. He didn't even recognize Elgaldia, the god of war. If there was anyone that he should remember, it should have been Elgaldia. The physical form of the god of war currently took was different than it had been the night Dethos almost died, but the change in his physical manifestation shouldn't be enough to make him unidentifiable. All the important, noticeable features were still there. He'd just gotten significantly bigger in stature. An ad is going to happen. Oh no, an ad. Could be at any point because it doesn't tell me properly when it's going to happen. Oh no! He didn't even recognize Elgaldia, the god of war. Blah blah blah. Done this bit. The physical form of the god of war currently took was different than it had been the night Dethos almost died, but the change in his physical manifestation shouldn't be enough to make him unidentifiable. All the important, noticeable features were still there. He just got significantly bigger in stature. A lot of people hadn't been happy with the decision to include the god of war in this little experiment. But if Dethos couldn't even remember him, then his memory loss was more extensive than they worried. I think it might be psychological, personally, Omdum suggested. It makes sense considering how traumatic the events that got him here were. The battle was horrible for all that were there, and Dethos's wounds were so severe. It's a miracle that he survived. It wasn't inconceivable that this is what happened to Dethos. Traumatic situations change you. Maybe this time they had changed his memories to keep him alive. Remembering the battle was something many who had fought in it wished they could no longer do. It haunted them in the quiet moments of their days. Omdum was used to seeing them here in the healing halls, usually at night, desperately looking for something to take the memories away. He couldn't take them, but he could help them cope with them better and stop them from becoming overwhelmed. Dethos' situation was the exact opposite. He was a god who had experienced one of the worst things that could happen to a deity, and yet had no memory of it. How did you approach a situation like that? The wounds were... Oh no, where's it gone? I can't remember where I was. Oh no. Oh no. We'll go from here. Dethos' situation was the exact opposite. He was a god who had experienced one of the worst things that could happen to a deity, and yet he had no memory of it. How did you approach a situation like that? The wounds were worse than they are now, a junior asked, horrified. They were holding the God of Wheat's medical charts, across which were documented the multiple wounds his manifestation was riddled with. The chart looked more like a guide for scoring a festival ham than an actual medical record. The wounds you see now are nothing in comparison, the god of healing shuddered at the memory. Killing a god through wounds to their manifested body is almost impossible. So just imagine the scene I walked into, a fresh-eyed god of battlefield medicine. It was only the healing spring that could have healed him. We barely even managed to keep him alive long enough to get him there in the first place. It really had been something miraculous. A wonder. He could still remember the blood dripping through his hands as the other healing deities thrust the body of Dethos into his shaking arms and screamed at him to run. Many deities across both realms had lost a physical manifestation that day. Many were greatly wounded or forced to spend years regaining their former strength. Totally not yawning right now. The former god of war had died, yes, but after suffering wounds even greater than that of Dethos over the course of the entire war. Years of bleeding, and followers that had begun to doubt his ability to defeat the demon realm, had led to a horrifying death. You're back, you survived the ad break, and so I think it chopped off the end of a sentence though, so I'm going to reread it. Years of bleeding and followers that had begun to doubt his ability to defeat the demon realm had led to a horrifying death. The god of wheat had stood with one foot in the halls of the dead and the other in the land of the living, edging ever further away from them. Omdum had never seen anyone get so close to death but not die before. In his forced restrainment in the lake of healing, Dethos had also lost his following, and that was something that had killed many deities on its own throughout history. Here he was, alive, a god without any believers. If the lake was supposed to heal him completely, hasn't he woken up too early? A tired senior healer asked. She was holding several medical texts in her arms and tiredly leaning against the wall of Omdum's office as she flicked through them, looking for answers. Yes, 4,000 years may seem long, but this was definitely too early to be waking, Omdum replied, equally as tiredly. He may no longer need to sleep, but that didn't mean reading ancient medical tomes was something he found exhilarating. The ancient deities that had come before him had notoriously bad handwriting. It really was puzzling to him why Dethos had awoken so early, when he had been placed there within the healing waters of the spring. They had calculated that it would probably take 6,000 years to heal his manifested body. Well, for it to heal enough for Dethos to be strong enough to heal the rest on his own. The body he was using now was nowhere near the level of healing that they would have predicted him to be at by this point either. Something had delayed the healing, something had awoken him, and something had let him free from the restraining chains that should be holding the small god down there. And yet every day that he was lying there, unable to fulfill prayers, the same female senior member of staff started to say, before she was interrupted by her boss, I understand everyone's concerns, but you must remember that we put Dethos there to stop him from dying. Yes, being there might well have killed him too. Human memory is only so long, but it was a risk that we had to take. It might seem to the less experienced healing deities that the choice he had made was to let a good god die, or purely to just prolong his death, but he had taken the one with the most hope for a good outcome. Even the strongest of deities can fade away from the memory of even their fellow colleagues, a junior added with a sad look upon their face, as they folded bandages carefully into tight rolls in a corner of their room. Everyone sighed. The more that they tried to probe the situation, the more convoluted it seemed to become. Plans were made to brew a memory potion for Dethos from the sacred herbs only found in the gardens cared for by Mother Willow, and to ask the goddess of memory to come if the potion had no effect. Hopefully now that Dethos was fully conscious and settling back into a safe environment, with familiar objects and people, his memory would return on its own. They would be there to support him through it. As much as they all wanted Dethos to regain his memories, it wouldn't it wouldn't only be the good ones that were coming back. It would be best to slowly introduce him to the events of the past if there is no sign of improvement. He shouldn't have to find out what happened from idly gossiping deities with no understanding of the distress that could cause, Omdum added. He was worried that hearing the wrong information from the wrong people could set everything back. Dethos didn't need to find out everything in one go. It would be too much. They didn't need the situation to get any worse than it already was right now. Omdum, the god of healing, dismissed them all before turning to Elgaldir, who had been standing in the corner for the entire meeting, worrying the corner of a handkerchief silently. He took note of the deep wrinkles crinkled into the god of war's forehead. It's not your fault, he said, laying his hand gently on the highest part of Elgaldir's arm he could comfortably reach. Elgaldir sighed, a sigh only the bone-weary could muster. Mini-theatre. Omdum, nervously looking over at a brooding god of war. Senior healer, should he be here? Omdum, ignore our friend in the corner. Senior healer, it's kind of hard to. Elgaldius, surrounded by an ominous aura. Don't mind me. Junior, but what about patient confidentiality? Arthur, what a good question. Does the Heavenly Realm even have their own version of the Data Protection Act, with the amount of gossiping these days can get up to? I highly doubt it. For anyone not British, the Data Protection Act protects British people's data. Yeah, it's kind of like HIPAA, but it doesn't only affect health information, shall we say. She says, it's been a while since I had to learn about. Chapter 21. Fever Dream. The first day in the healing halls wasn't very memorable aside from his awakening and the short conversation Dax had with the god of war. Various different healers had bustled in and out, jabbing him with needles and scanning him with various different types of equipment. All he had been able to do was lie there and let it happen, too tired to protest. They had fed him some soup, though. It wasn't even as bland as he had thought it would be, just looking at the almost clear broth. 3/4 of his way through the bowl, his arm had begun to shake uncontrollably. Soup sloshed out of the spoon as he attempted to lift it to his lips. Dax swapped hands, but the result was still the same. His stomach still felt empty, and it growled loudly in protest as another new person in purple robes arrived. The sheer loudness of it must have shocked her as she reached to take his temperature. Dax looked at her pleadingly. He didn't even have the energy to speak anymore. She smiled at him before taking a seat at the side of his bed and picking up the spoon for him. Being fed by someone else could feel infantilizing and extremely embarrassing, but she talked to him as she fed him about the weather and her family, and it made things feel okay. She was someone he would remember the kindness of. Dax made a mental note to write her a card before he was discharged, if he was ever allowed to leave this hospital. On the second day, he was strong enough to feed himself, but 2 young healers had to help him change the bandages crisscrossing his torso. Dax was too scared he would accidentally hurt himself again to do it on his own. Things took a turn for the worse on the 3rd day. Despite the almost constant attention of what felt like an army of healers, his wounds began to become increasingly inflamed. At first, they had thought that the swelling was a sign his body was healing at a more normal rate, but it became apparent on the 4th day that they were infected when his fever spiked. His fever peaked so high that if he was still a human, he would have died. As a god, it wouldn't have normally been life-threatening, but then the immortal beings of the heavenly realm and the underworld almost never experienced them. Dax just had the luck to currently be possessing a body that was doing its very best to stay alive when there was next to no resources for it to draw upon. He had nightmares of giant spiders coming to eat him whilst he was stuck in their webs, unable to get away. His mother and father stood over him, aging rapidly in front of his eyes until they were just a pile of bones that turned to ash and floated away. He drowned in the local swimming pool he'd grown up going to, only instead of chlorinated pool water and foam floaties, there was blood and severed limbs. There were moments when he could swear he was awake and the god of war was sitting beside him, holding a basin of water in one of his huge hands and a cloth in the other. Something wet and cold wiped his face and neck, and then he would be able to sleep again, undisturbed by nightmares, for a few minutes, before he awoke screaming again, chased by some nightmare vision. Dax had no idea how many days had passed like this, but when his fever broke, the basin and the man were nowhere to be seen. The system was unable to answer any of his questions, replying only that it did not have any medical functions and that its calendar was malfunctioning. Even the healers wouldn't answer his question of whether the god of war had been here, always trying to divert his attention away onto some other topic. After being covered in what felt like every lotion and potion that had ever existed, and swallowing a load of medicine that tasted like soap, the inflammation reduced. Wounds that had still been wet to the touch began to form tougher scabs, and those already scabbed over began to contract. The itchiness was almost unbearable, but Dax was happy that things were getting better. When washing his hair that had been bathed in sweat, Dax had finally seen the body in a mirror. His eyes were first drawn to the pattern of bold pink raised lines that covered his torso, arms, and upper thighs. It was truly an impressive sight. Various healers had been quick to assure him that the colour would fade with time and they would be increasingly hard to notice. They were never truly going to disappear, remaining a permanent reminder of events he strongly couldn't remember. The last week he spent in the hospital, instead of having him lay in bed, he'd been encouraged to walk around his room and eventually the building to build up strength once more. During his stay in the cave, he had felt constantly lightheaded, but here that feeling had lessened greatly. After 7 days, he could walk up and down the long corridor outside of his room twice whilst holding onto the railing without passing out. It was this achievement that he had thought impossible the first day, when he had stood up out of bed and immediately collapsed. Food was brought to him hourly, and Dax ate it ravenously as the healers looked at him with concerned faces. They were probably afraid that he would eat them out of house and home, because no matter how much food he ate, the hunger still remained. He'd graduated onto solid foods now, which were much more enjoyable and made him feel full for longer. There was this little cake that had this sort of thick caramel sauce on it that he could eat till it started coming out of its ears. Unfortunately, the healers had cut him off after 4. Before being discharged, he had to prove to a rather young-looking god that he could stand on his own and walk up and down 3 stairs unaided, something that had felt decidedly unsafe yesterday, though now he felt confident that he could make it at least that far. Dax didn't want to be featured in the next "I've fallen and I can't get up" advert. When he was finally allowed to leave, Dax found himself being given endless brochures on outpatient services and the moisturizing regimen that he was supposed to follow to reduce his scarring and physiotherapy. It felt rather absurd standing there holding the huge stack of papers, a feeling that wasn't helped by the system asking him if he wanted to set a reminder to apply moisturizer in a snarky sounding voice. I thought you didn't have any medical functions, Dax replied while struggling to open a pull door. System's response was to ignore him. He somewhat unwillingly agreed to set the reminder. Following the regimen and stretching properly were going to be important to ensure that he didn't lose flexibility as the scars matured. Then he was free to go home, but not to his home. Congratulations! A little puff of confetti was released again from the system. Your host body is now healed enough to unlock basic godly skills. Finding that voice again was hard. If you haven't watched before, System is the only one that gets a voice. Because it's a robot. As Jack stood alone in the lobby of the hospital, a gentle breeze blew the confetti. It sparkled in the light as it was lifted high into the rafters, and he realized that he had no idea where Dethos called home. Godly skills? Jax asked, distracted for a moment from the issue of finding his house in a city crammed with buildings. Did you think the god of wheat didn't have any powers? System sounded annoyed, or as annoyed as an AI voice could be. The golden light that it emitted. Sorry, nearly burped. Right. The golden light that it emitted flickered red momentarily. Dax felt like he was being judged by it. He didn't know what he had been expecting. You currently have the skill grow wheat, it informed him. As it did so, the AI showed him some interesting data on this ability on a small screen below its orb. As Dethos, god of wheat, you have the ability to grow wheat on pretty much any surface, though for best results, fertilized tilled farmland should be used. This skill uses a small amount of power. Makes sense, Dax said. Being the god of wheat, it would be pretty odd if he didn't have any actual wheat or wheat byproduct-based powers. Growing it seemed like a power that would be pretty basic and probably pretty useful. Would you like to test it out? System asked. Its annoyance with him seemed to have cleared. How? It was one thing to be told that you had heavenly powers and another to actually know how to use them. Dax thought of the wizard and witch stories of his youth and hoped that he wasn't going to have to remember hundreds of Latin phrases and hand gestures in order to do it. You just have to think about growing wheat. That seems suspiciously easy. Dax was genuinely surprised that there wasn't going to be 75 tasks that he had to complete beforehand. This isn't an This isn't an MMORPG, Dax, he thought to himself. It seems to be real life. You are a god now. It's supposed to be easy. System counted as it bobbed up and down, playfully rhythmic patterns of gold and silver light passing across its round surface. It resembled a rather expensive-looking mood light. Dax thought that he might as well give it a try. What harm could blindly attempting to do magic/godly power stuff possibly do? Holding his eyes closed. Closing his eyes tightly, he tried to think about wheat, but now actually having to think about this particular cereal crop made him realize that he personally didn't know all that much about it. In fact, he couldn't even really picture what wheat looked like. He knew it was a plant that you get flour from and that grows in fields, but that was pretty much the summation of his knowledge on the subject. System was waiting for him to do something, but his mind was completely blank. Only the word wheat was bouncing around in it like a DVD screensaver. A single anemic-looking leaf puffed into existence in the palm of his left hand before wilting and crumbling into dust. Mini-theatre. Author. Imagine being a weight god and not even knowing what weight looks like. Dax, you made me a city gamer boy. What do you expect? Dethos silently judges. For reference, that dream about drowning in a swimming pool filled with blood and limbs is one that I've personally have quite often. You know, if you're gonna have a weird dream, might as well put it in your book. To at least get something from it. Chapter 22. Home Sweet Bread Collection. Though he had been cleared by several healers to go home, it became very obvious to every one of them that Dethos actually had no idea where that home was. After being discharged, they had kept him under observation, and the God of Wheat had just stood in the lobby, on his own, staring out of a window into the street beyond, looking increasingly distressed. Dum sent a nursing assistant out to bring him back to his room. If he couldn't remember where he lived, it wasn't safe for him to roam the streets of Heavenly City on his own. So whilst they arranged an escort for him, Dax had to remain at the hospital for another night, wondering who that would be. Couldn't you just show me the destination on a mini-map and I just go home that way? Dax asked the sister. I am capable of doing that, but leaving the healing halls unaccompanied would be OOC behavior for Dethos. The AI responded, you should just wait for the escort. So he did. Someone came early in the morning and knocked smartly on the door of his room. When he entered the room, he took up a large part of it. The guy was huge, despite not being quite as huge as the man that had been here the day Dax woke up. His clothes were the same colour as his former visitor, though, and Dax wondered if they worked together. If everyone in the hospital wore purple robes, it wasn't too big of a stretch to think that there would be other uniforms for other specialities. Good morning, Dax said as he wrestled with the long hair of the body he was occupying. Long curly hair was a lot harder to look after than his own short hair had been. Half the time he'd been able to get away with just running his fingers through it in the morning and calling it quits. This hair needed to actually be brushed. Good morning, the visitor replied as he bowed to him. Dax smiled at him. The voice was familiar. Now that he had heard it, he recognized the man in front of him as one of the large array of visitors that had been through the doors of his hospital room. Pardon me. That had been through the doors of his hospital room over the past few days. I'm Nywes. I work in the war department, but the God of Healing asked me to escort you home. Oh, thank you. He'd been wondering how the fuck he was meant to get back to a place he had both no idea of the location of, or what it even looked like. Sure, a system would probably help him if he became totally lost, but that would be at the risk of losing both upgrade points and this new life entirely if he messed up badly enough. They both gathered together the few items that Dax had in the room into a bag that the other had brought with him before leaving. There hadn't been a lot of things to pack. The robes that he was found in were folded neatly in the bottom of the bag, and he shoved the brick of paper leaflets in on top of it. On their way out, Dax made sure that they passed the healer's desk so that he could pass on the card he had made for the woman who had helped him eat the soup that felt like months ago now. Someone that could help a patient while supporting their dignity like that was a special health worker, and they needed to know it. When they finally made it to the entrance, Dax was able to feel the wind on his skin. He could feel tears starting to form in his eyes, but he forcefully demanded that they not fall. Now that he was finally able to see what this heavenly realm looked like, the halls of healing were basically just a big fancy hospital that's more natural looking from the outside. Fancy carved wood and random climbing plants dominated its style, but rather than giving off whimsical, mysterious, elven vibes, it was giving more business attempts to make a better atmosphere for staff by filling the lobby with ferns vibes. The other buildings were a hodgepodge of architectural styles and materials, from towering classic white marble mansions to simple clay brick or intricate stained glass. You could see in the distance a cherry tree covered with shining lights, a pyramid made from glassy obsidian, and something that resembled a weathered brutalist concrete tower block. Niwes walked him to a fancy-looking carriage and opened the door for him to get in. "Mind your head as you step in," he said, as he held his hand over the top of the door so that Dax wouldn't bang his head on it. It took a lot more strength than he had anticipated climbing up into the carriage. In every historical drama, movie, or game Dax had seen, carriages had a little set of steps to help you get up into it. This one didn't. So he had to lift his right leg up onto the floor of the carriage, grab hold of the handles on either side of the door, and pull himself up, almost like mounting a horse. It would have been awkward in his old MMORPG player body. In this one, it was very straining. Muscles in his arms and back were not happy at the effort that they were put to. It felt like he was about to rip something, but after some awkward flailing on his part, Dax did get up there on his own, and he was proud of that. Niwes was the only person to see it happen. He'd been standing right next to him, holding the door open for him the entire time. Dax almost fell after getting in the coach, as he missed the seat but managed to scramble his way to it properly. Dax brushed some fluff off his trousers as he waited for the other god to climb up into the carriage with him. Niwes seemed like he almost floated into the vehicle. His face betrayed no muscular strain, almost as if he had stepped over a beetle rather than climbing up into a carriage. It was very impressive. Once he was seated and the doors firmly closed, the horses took off. Dax was a little freaked out by the horses not having a driver, but decided that since they were in the heavenly realm, there was probably some sort of magic at hand. He wasn't sure if that made him trust what was happening, but he certainly felt less like he was hurtling to a certain death in a wooden box. Who knows, the horses might even talk and have like an office job or something. He'd read fairy tales about talking animals, and that was magic, so there was no reason the heavenly realm couldn't be filled with talking animals. The thought of horses in suits and ties using a photocopier was rather amusing. "Can we concentrate, please?" That was the system. "Can we concentrate, please?" System asked, interrupting the horse-based office comedy he had started building in his mind. The two gods finally made their way up the hill past palaces that increased in size and craftsmanship, roads that had been wide thoroughfares. Narrowed, and the number and size of plants that bordered them increased. Niwes dropped him off at the front gate of the huge building that apparently was his home. Home was a pretty odd word to describe to a building the size and grandness of one he was looking at. It looked more like a town hall, museum, library, some sort of municipal building than the residence of one person. You could easily house about 1,000 people in that place purely from just seeing the front of it. He shuddered to think how many rooms were in it. The white marble walls in of themselves were ostentatious, but softened by the flowers that were overflowing from the garden within. Niwes left him at the gate, and after they had said their goodbyes, Dax pushed it open, not knowing what he was going to meet on the other side. It was beautiful, empty of people, but overflowing with flowers and butterflies. The gravel crunched underneath his feet, and as he made his way towards the beautiful front door. The neatness of the garden took him by surprise, though they hadn't gone very into depth about it. Dax had been able to pick up from the hospital staff that Dethos had been gone for a considerable amount of time, yet the garden was pristine as if it was tended to regularly by someone that knew what they were doing, and did it well. Dax wondered if the garden was imbued with some sort of powers that enabled it to maintain itself. He was the god of wheat right now, and that had to come with more abilities than just being able to make wheat grow. He walked through the unlocked, heavy wooden front doors and was confronted by a narrow hall in which a large glass cabinet filled with a variety of old-looking bread loaves stood. There were some very fancy decorative ones, plaited wreaths covered in flowers, also made of bread, even one that looked like a bread basket full of loaves. There were flatbreads and buns and pretzels and breadsticks and white bread and wholemeal and brown. A whole kaleidoscope of brown carbohydrates. It was pretty extensive, obviously an intense interest at some point. Being the god of wheat, it made sense. Bread was pretty important in the human world, and most of it was made of wheat. System displayed another screen to him, upon which the phrase, "You have unlocked the character trait, bread collection enthusiast," must show interest in various bread products, both wheat and non-wheat, was shown. Plus 10 points for showing interest in learning things about the host. System beeped happily, sitting on top of the cabinet. Dax was just a little bit closer to getting the upgrade he really needed. The next room was large too, chairs and potted plants. Surprisingly still alive, everywhere, but luckily no more bread. It had a dark red carpet, and on the wall directly opposite him there was a large gilded picture frame hanging, the sort you would see in some dusty stately home behind a rope holding back visitors. It felt like the frame should have its own little red velvet curtain with a golden tassel. Dax felt drawn to it. It felt important, too important not to investigate it further. He walked up to the frame and peered beyond its glass to the object that was sandwiched between it. What had at first appeared to be a red blob from further away was actually an intricately tied knot. It was beautiful. It was beautiful. It was also beautiful. Someone had obviously put a lot of time and effort into the tying of it. Dax found himself tearing up, but without knowing the reason why. This must be something that was important to Dethos, he thought. The body remembered something that he was unable to. Over the next few days, he was almost constantly welcoming and waving away visitors to his new home. It made for a very odd housewarming. Many of them were people that had visited him in his hospital room, but there were also a large number he'd never seen before. Dax made a conscious effort to try and remember as many names as possible. Apparently Dethos had been a very popular god. He'd been eating many times when they had shown up, and they'd always commented on it, looking at him with worried faces that they thought he hadn't noticed. It felt like he was at a family reunion, and all his aunts were scolding him either on how he was eating too much or eating too little. Deities didn't actually normally need to perform any mortal actions, so some kept sleeping as a sort of habit, and breathing was just a courtesy action for the humans. Not breathing tended to freak them out unnecessarily when you showed yourself to them. When weak from lack of godly powers or injury, it was common to need to do things like eating, but only a little snack. A half-time orange or a cereal bar would usually be enough. Dax was eating a full 3 meals a day. He learned to hide his eating after a while, but still the food would show up just outside of the gates every day in a beautifully decorated basket, not a card or note to be seen as to who had left it there. So Dax met many new people and racked up points slowly over time. Mini theatre. Dax, who keeps leaving me food? Arthur, do you even have food? Do you know where to get food? Dax, I know how to get food. Arthur, heaven doesn't have a supermarket. You have to get food offerings from your believers. Dax, so someone gave me their religious offerings of food? The horror, the joy, the horror, the joy. Now it's time for a stretch break. Because my neck really be hurting right now. Also, this page is loading. Oh. Ow. Chapter 23. A Day of Unexpected Meetings. Dax's daily routine of waking up, applying the scar cream he was given at the hospital, diligently doing as much stretching as he could, and being constantly interrupted by seemingly well-meaning wishes, was broken one cloudy morning. He had woken up early because his whole body was itchy, and even after he had applied the cream, it was still so itchy that he couldn't go back to sleep. System was keeping track of the days for him now that it had patched the issues with its calendar software, because Dax's lack of day-to-day structure and him sleeping 15 to 16 hours a day made it almost impossible to have a normal understanding of the passage of time. There was a knock on the front door. Dax peeled away the blanket he was currently wrapped in, half asleep and with his hair sticking up in every direction to go answer it. Normally, he would care to groom himself just a little bit, but if people were expecting to be able to come visit him unannounced when the sun had only just peeped over the horizon, they would have to lower their expectations about his appearance. When he finally made it to the door, someone in a smart turquoise uniform was waiting for him on the doorstep. They reached out and handed a piece of paper to him. "The Emperor of Heaven invites you to an audience with him this morning," they announced as Dax Speed read the note. It was indeed an invitation to a meeting. When an emperor invited you to a meeting, it was more of a summons than a request, not particularly optional. The messenger left after telling him someone would be sent to escort him to the palace later on in the evening. Or morning. It's morning. I don't know why I read evening. We're at that point, everyone, where my brain makes up. Dax then rushed to pick up his breakfast at the gate, his appearance drawing an amused looks from the guards that stood there. He may have had to sit on the decorative stone border edging several times on the way there and back to rest for a while, but he made it there and back quicker than he did yesterday. Today there were some really tasty apples and a porridge that had what he thought was possibly strawberry jam. It was still warm and came with a spoon. Dax scarfed it all down before changing into his last set of clean clothes he had brought from the hospital and attempting to do something with his hair. Despite now having been home for several days, he had only ventured out of the large reception room he was currently sitting in to get food and shoo away unwanted guests. In that time, Dax had not come across a hairbrush, so he had to resort to finger combing his hair, which didn't help, but did make him look passingly presentable. Just as he was anxiously passing his fingers through it one more time, another knock came at his front door. Here was his escort to the palace of the Emperor, yet again someone whose face was unrecognizable. Dax was still feeling very wary of everyone here. Though no one had really done anything to cause him to feel that way, the looks that they all gave him were uncomfortably pressuring. The member of staff that had been sent to take him up to the palace was silent the entire journey up the hill. It was thankfully considerably shorter than the last trip he had taken in a carriage, but Dax found himself feeling very grateful that he wasn't expected to walk it. He was also spared the indignity of scrambling up into it, as they had brought with them a small step-stool for him to use to get up to it. Just getting around one reception room, opening his front door, and walking down a relatively short path was strenuous enough for him right now. He couldn't even move some of the spindly chairs so that he could place them along his route as spaces to sit and catch his breath without almost passing out. He was too prone to dizziness still to move something that probably weighed 2 kilos and would prevent him from feeling dizzy. Like stuck in a circle of things being unhelpful. He'd actually fainted on more than one occasion, just trying to put it on a chair, like a jacket, trying to put a chair in the bread museum hall so that he could peruse the collection a little more in depth. Luckily, the floor was luxuriously carpeted, and it took a lot to bruise a god, even one as weak as him. It was almost funny. He hadn't even been able to explore his own house, yet here he was, being all but dragged to the heavenly emperor's palace. Before too long, after winding their way further and further up the increasingly narrow road, they reached its zenith. Dax was helped down from the carriage by his escort, and once he was standing again on the stable ground, he looked up at the building in front of him. Thinking that the palace of the weak god was huge had it seemed been a rather naive thought. The palace of the Emperor of Heaven was so large that it barely made sense to consider it a single dwelling. The castle itself stood upon an outcrop of white belemmerite, Author's note. It's better known as Moonstone. In the centre of the plateau, innumerable tons of opaque, milky white stone stood upon it. As he moved forwards, facets in the stone took on a light blue or bright blue, purple tone that instantly made him think of mermaids. High walls surrounded the palace, within which lay imposing towers, columns, cloisters, endless rooms linked by snaking corridors, indoor courtyards, outdoor courtyards, and probably about 8 levels of basement and cellars. How could you keep somewhere like that clean without hundreds of on-call cleaners? There was no way he could compare Dethos's home to that of the Emperor, despite the Emperor's palace also being made of a similar coloured stone. There were so many different security checks that Dax had to pass through before being led to the actual throne room. He wasn't carrying any weapons, and everyone knew that. He was nowhere near strong enough at the moment to do any kind of damage to the Emperor or either of his partners, so they were more of a formality than anything. Knowing that, however, did not help douse his increasing annoyance. When he had finally cleared all of them and they'd brought him to the throne room, Dax felt ready to drop. The muscles in both of his legs were burning, and he's starting to find it. The muscles in both of his legs were burning, and he was starting to find it was taking more and more of his concentration to be able to walk normally. Something that he was normally able to do a bit slower than he usually would was now an activity that Dax was having to actively think about. His knees were shaking so hard that they were beginning to bruise. He looked over his escort, but they were already standing at the throne room door, talking to the 2 guards standing on either side of it. Dax sighed. He wanted to sit down for 2 minutes, and right now the plush carpeted floor was looking rather comfortable. Sitting on the floor in the Emperor's palace was probably incredibly rude, but if that was so, he should buy a few chairs for people. Disability wasn't something the Emperor of Heaven thought about all that often. When he was halfway to the door, it opened, pulled from the other side. As it did so, it creaked terribly, and the sound reverberated through the narrow passageway. Dax jumped at the sudden noise and then scolded himself for being jump-scared by a door. Everyone turned at the sound to see the towering manifestation of the god of war standing in the doorway. Dax's gaze fell upon him as well, happy to see someone he could recognize in this strange new world. He smiled as their eyes met, and the other looked at him, seemingly shocked to see him there. From where he was standing, Dax had a good view of the taller god's face, and although the god of war attempted to maintain a neutral expression, for a fleeting moment something that looked like pain flashed across it. Dax found himself frowning in response. What was it about him that was making the other deity so uncomfortable? They hadn't crossed paths since meeting in the hospital. Speaking of the hospital, he was sure now that this mountain of a man had been the one who had been by his side during the terrible fever-induced nightmares when his wounds were infected. It had to be him. Maybe that was why he was so uncomfortable. Had he said something weird? Surely the system would have punished him severely if he'd let the cat out of the bag. More than punish, actually. He would very likely be very dead right now if that were to happen. The god of war's face smoothed over almost instantaneously as he composed himself before continuing his way down the corridor Dax had just walked down. All 3 of the staff standing by the door moved out of his way, but their eyes remained staring at the back of his head. Their conversation had been interrupted by the presence of the leaving god. Now that he was out of earshot, it burst forth anew. Who said gossip was a human pastime? The looks that the guards were giving our giant friend weren't lost on Dax, and it increased his own discomfort, which was starting to bubble forth. What was wrong? Everyone was acting like this guy was a social pariah that they were too scared to do anything about. No one had said anything to Dax. Maybe it was something that he was supposed to remember, but by now, by the results of all the tests, it should be blatantly obvious that Dax did not have any of Dethos's memories by now. He drew level with Dax, who could see him swallow heavily, scanning Dethos's body quickly with his eyes. Though the corridor was wide enough normally for 2 people to comfortably pass one another, this guy was built like a mountain that had gained sentience in this artificially narrow space, their hands brushed against one another as the architecture of the space forced them closer together. Dax found himself reflexively reaching out to grab the other person's hand. For 5 whole seconds he could only think how stupid he must look and how embarrassing this was. A feeling that quickly resolved when the shovel-sized hand he suddenly found himself holding loosely tightened its own grip around his much smaller one. There were words that he wanted to say, but Dax found his throat was painfully tight, and he couldn't get any sound out of his mouth. Tears started to well in his own eyes as an overwhelming foreign emotion rolled over him. He couldn't label what it was, but it was strong enough that he felt like he was drowning in it. Sorry, itchy nose. Ugh. He looked up, meeting the slow blinking eyes of his mutual handholder. His own expression was just as pained as Dax imagined his own was, the tears welling in the corners of his eyes, a mirror image. It was hurting him to keep holding on to this man, but the thought of letting go of his hand was almost worse. "Congratulations," the system chimed, though this time it didn't release its trademark gold confetti. Confetti. It had likely run out of it by now. "You've spent enough time with this deity to unlock Dethos, god of wheat and wheat byproducts, relationship, status bar. We look forward to your continued cooperation." Dax almost choked, but he still managed to ask, "And you're still not going to tell me his name?" A short message showing his added points and the current balance scrolled by, but Dax was too busy being distracted by the tension in the room. It didn't help that a large pink bar was hovering over the head of the god of war. The guide that had escorted him the entire way here in complete silence was visibly bristling and had left the door to come place a hand on Dax's shoulder. He found himself slowly but assuredly being pulled away towards the door, with no idea of how they had gotten so close to him without him knowing. The remaining guards had left their places too, and had begun walking towards the group. His hand-holding partner shook his head resolutely and dropped Dax's hand. Pain that had erupted at their touching immediately stopped once they were no longer in physical contact with one another. His escort and the guards tried to rush Dax away through the door, but his gaze fell upon the god of war. Determination filled him to find out this mysterious guy's name and what relationship Dethos had had with him. Why was everyone acting so weird? The mountain-sized god that held his interest walked hurriedly down the corridor, only stealing a short backwards glance before he turned the corner. "Who was that?" Dax asked, genuinely curious as to who this guy that kept popping into his life was. "That's Elgaldir, the god of war," one of the guards explained, reluctantly, as if he was telling Dax some classified government secret. The other guard glared at them and whispered, "Why would you?" Dax only heard the first part of the admonishment before the two devolved into an almost silent whisper fight. There were a lot of violent-looking hand gestures involved. "Are you coming in or not?" asked another guard on the other side of the door. As they leaned over, their hair fell out of the clip that they were using to hold it up, even. Dax picked up the clip and handed it back to them, admiring the glittered butterfly shape of it, and then he was waved through. On the other side of the door was the throne room, and it was almost empty. Aside from the guards who had waved him through, a handful of people were ferrying papers, and closer at the throne there were deities wearing incredibly fancy robes. The group was fiercely chattering together and staring at him as he entered into their line of sight. They looked like the veteran players of an 18-year-old MMORPG that had collected every possible cosmetic in-game and wanted to show off their fabulous outfits. Up a short series of stairs and resting on a dais of black glass were three thrones. At this moment only the central throne was occupied. The occupant beckoned him to come up the stairs, and so he did. He hoped that this conversation wasn't going to be long. He could feel his shaking legs become increasingly unstable beneath him. This had to be the Emperor of Heaven himself that sat before him. He was wearing a crown so large and ornate that it was hard to think that he could be anything else. Having name tags on would have been so useful right now. Tethos, he called, his voice echoing off of all the polished stone. It took Dax slightly too long to respond to this, and the system gave him a warning for it. It bobbed in front of him, flashing red and pulling out the OOC banner somewhat over-enthusiastically. Your Majesty? Dax did his best to bow. It felt like that was the right thing to do. People were more likely to complain if you were too informal than if you were overly formal, after all. We are glad to see you looking so well after the horrendous nature of your injuries, the Emperor of Heaven said. Thank you, Dax was unsure what else to say without giving himself away. People have told us that you have been eating food. I was hungry. It was an honest answer, though it seemed by the shocked face of the Emperor. Ow. Though it seemed by the shocked face the Emperor was currently wearing, it might have been a tad too honest. If gods didn't eat, then why did people leave them food? Offerings. Hungry? The Emperor asked, with a shocked look on his face. He leaned forward on his throne and stared at Dax intently, as if scanning him for something wrong. His hair was filled with small crystals, and they made a soft tinkling noise as his hair swung forward. Yes. It seemed like it was best to continue to be honest about this. There must be something wrong. The concerned look on the Emperor's face only seemed to grow. Dax found himself panicking. Was he going to get caught out for not being Dethos? Was System going to replace him? He just cheated death. He didn't want to meet it again. It's normal that you might still be weak from the wounds, but you should have regained your basic god skills, explained the Emperor. Glittering spots of light were given off when he shook his head, and they danced on the polished stone interior of the vast room. Dax was reminded momentarily of fireflies before he made his response. I can make wheat grow. Most deities don't need to eat, the Emperor pointed out concernedly. Oh, that was a pretty shocking thing to find out, especially when he was still feeling almost constantly hungry still. Right now he was thinking about how good a toasted cheese sandwich would taste. Toasted cheese sandwich is never a wrong option. Unless you're allergic to anything that's in it. So if one were to take into consideration how long you've been unable to fulfill prayers, a lack of god power would be understandable. Dax resisted the urge to wipe the sweat from his brow, glad that the Emperor had made an excuse for him. Looks like there was a lot of work to be done if he was going to fit in without being noticed. Mini-theatre. Guard 1. You couldn't have stopped them touching. Escort. No one told me the god of war was going to be here. Elgaldia coughs politely. Guard 2. Welcome back, sir. Sweats profusely. And that's the end of this chapter. Take a few seconds to stretch again. Chapter 24. Someone else's memories. After you were injured, there was a landslide. The Emperor of Heaven began starting in the middle of the story rather than at the beginning. If this was a movie from the golden age of film, this would be the point where a screen went wibbly-wobbly and someone would twang a few strings on a harp. But it's not, so you have to imagine that for yourself. The battle had taken weeks, the war a wearingly long expanse of time, even for immortal beings, leaving behind death and destruction in its wake. When Bulmar lay dead, his body disintegrating into ash beneath a sword impaled through his chest, embedding him into the ground, the survivors were left with the clean-up. So a few of them were left, fully capable of helping out with this strenuous task. Bodies belonging to the members of the demon realm littered the battlefields in every realm. In the last battle, only 2 deities had died belonging to the heavenly realm, but many were injured or tending to the humans who had been unfortunate enough to cross paths with the scythe of a death god or fell into an unexpected pool of lava. Volcano deities weren't particularly all that careful with where they left their byproducts at the best of times. Among the rubble and the debris of the landslide that had crashed through the valley like the mounds of armour and weapons that had been collected from the dead and the injured. They rose up from the rock like a morbid monument to victory and loss, a veritable mountain. There were plans to melt them down into a memorial statue already forming in the heavenly emperor's mind. It would be good for morale. The only problem was who to make the statue of. One of the martial goddesses had raced up to drill Venus, where he had been sitting on a fold-out chair one of his servants had brought for him. She was on the back of a pure gold celestial horse with flaming mane, the sort that glowed in the dark and only ate specially prepared celestial herbs. She pointed up to one of the actual mountains just as a horrified scream filled the air. Ilgalde was back. The head of everyone present, whether they were from the heavenly realm's forces or the defeated army of the demon realm, swiveled to look at him as if drawn by a magnet. No one had been able to predict that it would be so soon, and so they were left scrambling together, the remaining martial and healing deities, to try and prevent some of the chaos that was about to happen. They flew, ran, and rode their celestial mounts up the mountain to assist the new god of war. The party crested the top of the mountain, just in time to see the god of war fall to his knees and pick up something limp and covered in blood, another body on the field that had yet to be collected. The corpse of the fallen deity seemed impossibly small in his arms, in the new form he had been given upon his promotion. He screamed again, releasing a wave of energy that shook the ground. Some of the lesser deities lost their footing as the mountain moved under their feet, the sound that placed fear in the hearts of everyone present. At first they thought that they had lucked out, managing to get to the distressed god before he could cause too much damage to the surrounding environment. Then Elgaldia stood, holding the lifeless body in one arm, and slammed his sword into the ground. At first they could only feel the impact of the sword hitting and piercing the ground, but then to everyone's surprise the entire eastern side of the mountain collapsed. It started with a small boulder being dislodged 3/4 of the way up the eastern face of the mountain, but it was soon followed by soil, pebbles, and other large rocks. As they tumbled down the mountain, they gained speed and pulled other debris with it, until the entire side of the mountain resembled a flowing river of rock hurtling down into the wheat fields below. Fields already ruined by the battle and covered in boulders that would take years to remove. When the rockfall finally came to a stop, fields that had been fertile and full of ripe wheat, waiting to be harvested, were buried beneath tons of rock. Even those who were lucky enough to not be completely buried were still filled with plough-breaking rocks that would take years to completely remove with the limitations of human technology. Sorry, I just headbutted you there. There were screams as people noticed what had happened. The humans tried. They tried for decades, but the valley, once protected by the god of wheat, was no longer under that protection. What land they did manage to save was no longer fertile enough to sustain the people that remained, and so they dispersed across the world away from the valley, and belief in the god of wheat waned. For those that stayed, the wheat crop failed more times than it yielded. The god of wheat was no longer there to watch over them. His temple, buried under approximately half a mountain's worth of rock and dirt, lay waiting for his return. The lack of prayers is likely the cause of why you're so weak right now, explained Venus, the Emperor of Heaven. Looking down from his throne where Dax was standing, he was now done with his reminiscing about the past. Dax nodded, glad that the other had found an understandable reason of his own for what was going on with Dethos, and that he hadn't had to try to make up something himself. Despite the help that the system had given him, he still didn't know much about how the magic here actually worked. It probably wasn't a good idea to think of it as magic either. Heavenly powers? That would probably have to do. Then he left the throne room. When he left the throne room, it was with a sense of relief, but also the feeling that he'd only been told part of what actually happened back then. Him not having Dethos's memories was certainly an ample opportunity for others to try to obscure and or twist the past for their own benefit. It was something that he would have to talk to the system about. For now, Dax was only left with the furtive glances of people around him that they kept passing to each other when they thought he wasn't looking, and the mystery that was the god of war. Mini theatre. Drill Venus. And those are my memories. Dax, so you just left all that rock there and ruined hundreds of people's lives? Venus, there are many more important tasks to deal with at there were many more important tasks to deal with at that time, Dax, and I'm pretty sure you left some stuff out. Me? I would never, said Venus. Chapter 25. Iced coffee, warm blood. Every street, every gathering place, every office, and every dwelling place, from the palaces of the upper city to the cramped boarding houses of the lower city, was filled with gossip. News of the return of the fabled god of wheat had leaked out despite how cautious those in the know had been. It was causing a ruckus. Almost no one had ever met him, and those that had were relatively young at the time. To the young deities he had been an example that was held up of a god that was devoted to his followers, a tragic being, someone to aim to be like. He in their minds was just a historical figure on the edge of a myth that seniors scolded them to be more like, especially those whose gifts involved food-bearing plants. I heard he was pretty popular god back then, a young god said in a cafe in the middle city, surrounded by his friends, deities of a similar age, as they drank coffee together. It was a cold day, but they sat swirling straws through beverages filled with ice. The cubes rattled together in the glass. Fertility deities have an easy time, another god said as he stirred his own drink in big lazy circles. There were a few raised eyebrows at that comment, but no one pulled him up about it. Many of the other gods agreed with him, and the ones that didn't knew to keep their mouths shut. Fertility deities were predominantly female, and their ability to gather human followers was undeniable, but providing humans with food and children was a high-demand, high-stress speciality that wasn't for anyone wanting the weekends off of work. Without them, the human race would go extinct, and all of the deities would go with them. Many of the martial gods saw it as an easy win in a broken and oversaturated market that they themselves were struggling to gather followers in. Aren't you the god of door hinges? I don't think you have space to talk about whether someone has it easy or not, a tiny goddess asked around bites of a large loaf of crusty, caramelized onion bread. It's a time. And you're back, you survived. Alrinu is the deity of divine bacon, and they don't even get a humanoid body. Someone else added, pointing out a giant boar attempting to eat a plate of macarons and drinking lemonade out of a bucket. I think in comparison, we all have it easy. These two remarks fell on deaf ears, though, as the god of door hinges was patted on the back by several other gods who agreed with him. Why are you acting so sensitive? Are you on your period? You don't even have a calling. Oh, goddess of all the other things we don't know about yet, he sniggered, followed by his lackeys as the rest sat in uncomfortable silence or got up and left. You know my name is Kay, she ground out between her teeth, glaring at him over her sandwich. The once comfortable air of a meeting between friends was gone, and now there was a palpable tension in the group as the gulf between them widened. Someone made a sleazy joke about fertility gods, and before anyone could laugh or admonish him, he was pinned up against a wall, pinned up by his throat. Now struggling to breathe, the pinned deity looked down at the person who had begun choking them, only to see the esteemed god of war glaring a hole through him. Oh, I forgot you weren't together before. Ugh. Oh, I forgot. Weren't you together before you betrayed him? The god of door hinges sneered, leaning back in his chair. He was so laid back, he was almost horizontal. The more savvy of those still in the little gossip circle fled at the look in Elgaldi's eyes as he dropped the jokester he was holding by the throat and stalked over towards the god who shouldn't be feeling as comfortable as he was. The look in his eyes was chilling. Elgaldi was the sort of senior god that was very formal in his interactions with juniors. He could be seen as cold and rarely was the type of god to attend social engagements, but he was never visibly this angry in public. For a martial god, Elgaldi was usually the poster child for restraint. Only one topic could set him off like this, and the vast majority of residents in the city weren't stupid enough to provoke him. Though his physical body was standing there in that cafe in the middle city, his mind had been taken back in time to the Battle of Windblown Tears. A flashback to a much worse time. It was the night where everything had changed, and not for the better. Images passed his eyes, more a collaboration of obscure paintings than a movie. They were the shards of pieces of memory, moving past each other like a kaleidoscope, perpetually rolling, mixing memory and nightmare into a soup of broken fragments. In front of him, the former god of war died, killed by the emperor of the demon realm, who laughed whilst he did the killing. Bulmore's face smiled at him, the sick smile he'd seen so many times before. Elgaldia was holding a sword. It wasn't a sword. The weight was different. It was the god of war's sword. Now it was his sword. He was the god of war. He was the god of war now, and it felt wrong. Nothing felt right. Elgaldi's head felt like someone had split it in two with an axe, and maybe they had. He didn't remember. He was plunging the sword through the unprotected chest of Dethos. Dethos's face of ultimate betrayal looked up at him, big wide eyes and pale lips parted in shock. The golden blood of its protector sprayed over the equally golden wheat surrounding his feet. The realization of what had been done hit Elgaldia again. There was nothing he wouldn't do to go back there and save him. Save Dethos. He was shaking. Save Dethos. The smell of blood was too strong. He couldn't save Dethos. Mini theatre. Scene. Martial God Sensitivity Training 101. Remedial class. Teacher. So what do we think about fertility deities now, children? Martial gods sitting uncomfortably. They perform a critical service for the mortal world, and we should consider them as equally important as we are. No one in the heavenly realm or the underworld has an easy job. Teacher, so now I want you to write an apology letter to every fertility deity. Dethos, the god of wheat, and the god of war. Martial gods. Groan. It would take a decade of solid writing to write a letter to every fertility deity. New chapter 26. Climbing out the windows and causing paper avalanches. After the unexpected meeting with the Emperor, Dax found that the level of security that he was surrounded with had noticeably increased. There weren't just the one or two guards at the gate anymore. Every time he tried to get a moment to himself, to just be alone and maybe try to get some more information out of the system, someone would find him and hover around in the background. He hadn't thought that he would find the orb more appealing to talk to than an actual person until now. It seemed that no one could hear the system speak or see it flying around with him, but that didn't mean that Dax wanted Dethos to be misunderstood as talking to invisible things either. People already seemed to think he was crazy. Being followed everywhere was definitely starting to become annoying fast. Dax could understand that they wanted to be supportive and to keep an eye on him because he was so weak right now. He also understood that the previous owner of the body he was inhabiting had been killed by something, and that it was tantamount to a miracle that he was walking around again in the land of the living. That didn't stop people watching him eat bread, sleep on couch cushions on the dusty floor of a large salon, and struggle to make his way around his palatial home without stopping to take rests so as not to black out, feeling intrusive though. If they are going to be here, he thought, they might as well do something actually helpful. No matter how he tried to talk to the guards or engage them in helping him complete tasks he wasn't currently strong enough to do on his own, they just stood and watched Dax struggle. Adapting to this new life, with a body he couldn't trust not to pass out at any given moment, was stressful. He silently observed them too, now, when they thought that he was no longer looking at them. This was weird. Presumably they were reporting back to someone. Probably the Emperor, considering that they had appeared after Dax's meeting with them. There wasn't a lot for them to say. Dax felt as weak as a newborn lamb, and their presence in his life was making him uncomfortable. Oops, I just scrolled real far. Here we go. Haha. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but everywhere he turned there was a guard watching him, and it made him feel like he was going to get in trouble for something. Right now, as he slipped on the polished marble floor of a now somewhat familiar corridor, Dax was feeling pretty pissed off. Surely, if you really cared about someone, you would want to ensure that their house was safe for them, and to be in when they had suffered a life-changing injury. As he hit the floor again and glared resentfully at the guard who was barely paying attention to him laying on the cold, hard surface and kicking his legs wildly in frustration, Dax decided that he had had enough. It was time to make a daring escape. He sprang to his feet with newfound energy given to him by his anger, determined to break out of the routine that he had found himself trapped in. Dax put on a big show of being tired, yawning dramatically and alternating between squinting and rubbing his eyes for several minutes before declaring loudly that he wanted to go to bed. He still hadn't found an actual bed yet. The palace had so many rooms he hadn't even seen yet. It had multiple floors he hadn't seen yet. He used his ruse to get rid of the guard. Apparently they had decided that watching him sleep wasn't necessary anymore. Having someone watch you whilst you were asleep was incredibly creepy. Dax then shimmied open the large wooden sash window of the salon that he was currently using as a place to sleep. It was heavy but didn't stick as he had worried it might do. Some of the paint flaked off of the timber as he did so, but Dax swept it into the corner with his foot along with the other dust. Using an overly ornate-looking green velvet sofa, or maybe chaise longue, as a footstool, he climbed up to the windowsill and escaped out into the night. The garden was dark, lit only by small lanterns and the golden glow of several abnormally large moths sitting in the plethora of open camellia blossoms. As he crouched between two of the densely flowering shrubs, trying to regain his breath and plan on how to get out of here without being seen or disturbing the moths, Dax really wished that he had his phone with him to take a picture. As far as he knew, he couldn't have been here for less than 3 weeks, and this was the first time that he had truly had the luxury of taking a look around. After moving in, he hadn't been physically strong enough to do more than look around a few rooms on the ground floor and walk to and from the gate to his food delivery, and recently there had been the constant monitoring. Even then, he was still relying on being able to rest every few steps. Dax didn't want people thinking that Dethos didn't know his way around his own home. The system and he had talked about it extensively. It was better for people to think that he had forgotten people and events rather than his entire job as a god. Dax had tried to sweet-talk a map of the palace out of the AI helper, and it had refused, stating that it thought that that was cheating. Cheating will result in a fine of 100 points, it helpfully had informed him. Right now, he didn't have many points to lose, but the upgrades that he was saving for were vital in being able to not be murdered by a cantankerous, glowing, floating orb. It would be best to not invoke its anger, so they were taking priority. Right now, he had the chance to actually see what this palace had to offer. A building this large had to have a lot of interesting rooms. After all, the entrance hall was dedicated to a personal bird museum. Who knew, maybe there was an illicit butter knife museum in here somewhere. Dax finally felt ready to set out from his uncomfortable position between the two flowering shrubs and carefully squeezed beneath them. The cloud of glowing moths he had been worried about creating didn't happen. They were too busy feeding to notice being gently jostled. Dax walked slowly around the right side of the palace, marvelling at the sheer amount of flowers that had been squashed into the garden, and cursing whoever had decided that gravel should be what the path was made from. It crunched underneath his feet in a way that made it seem like it might have a vendetta against him. There were countless windows at the gable end of the palace, but eventually he found one that was easy to open from the outside and close enough to the ground that he could actually climb in there. Pulling himself up into a window and climbing out of a window were both difficult, but at least this time there was a plush carpet for him to land on the other side. It was a bit more comfortable to fall onto than pea gravel. The next few hours were spent walking in and out of various boring rooms and leaning on dusty formal furniture until he found a locked door. Potential plot development found, system chimed, adding more points to his growing pile. It wouldn't be long before he could finally make a purchase and make his life here a little easier. The door itself was a heavy dark wood, and although it had glass panels inset into it, they were made from frosted stained glass, so he was unable to see through them into the space beyond. How very convenient, Dax thought as he attempted to peer through the glass. "What is it?" he asked System, incredibly curious as to what lay beyond the locked door. "This room leads to the prayer processing office. All prayers to Dethos, god of wheat, are reviewed here," System explained as it hovered close to the door, the light from the orb illuminating the coloured pieces of glass, revealing that it was a complex design of wheat swaying in the field. "There is a room specifically for that?" Dax asked, amazed. He hadn't thought about what prayers actually looked like yet, or how he was even going to try to answer them. Though thinking about the sheer amount of rooms this palace had, it made sense, he supposed. "Can we get back in?" "As the lock on the door is attuned to Dethos, the wheat god, you should be able to open it," the orb explained, shining its light upon the door handle in question. Dax grabbed it and attempted to turn it more firmly than before. The hand rattled, but it remained stubbornly closed. "Your god powers are very low. You might have to remain in contact with the door handle for a prolonged amount of time," System explained. Dax sighed. Nothing was ever easy. So he stood there for an hour, testing whether or not it had opened yet every few minutes, trying not to lose his mind from boredom as he waited. It felt like time was inching along at the pace of a tired snail. His feet were starting to hurt by the time something happened. Eventually, though, the prolonged contact with the door handle actually did something, and Dax turned it excitedly. Once the handle was turned, the door practically exploded open. The sheer pressure of papers building up behind it almost knocked Dax off of his feet, pushing him backwards several meters. They spilled out in a tidal wave across the floor of the corridor and into an adjoining room. By the time the movement stopped, Dax was up to his mid-calf in papers, scrolls, and letters. I nearly said leaves. No leaves. Yeah. He picked up one of the many scrolls from the floor, unrolling it gently, not wanting to accidentally rip it. So many of the papers looked like they would disintegrate if even something so small as one of the moths from the garden landed on it. Despite not being the person that the prayers had been made to originally, Dax could feel the reverence that needed to be taken with them instinctively. Not treating the prayers of people that had at least believed in Dethos at some point in their lives well felt like a crime. He was inhabiting his body, and he owed the god the respect of treating his believers and their prayers well. It would be both embarrassing and shameful if they were ever to meet one day and he had to answer to damaging the prayers. Now was not the time to be clumsy. Written in blue ink on the prayer scroll that he had lifted from the pile were the words, "Please don't die," and it was signed, Elgaldir, in a large looping hand that made it almost impossible to read in the dim light. He wondered who this Elgaldir was and what their message meant. The rustling of the papers falling out of the prayer room finally silenced as they reached a new equilibrium. It was easy to see now that the room was completely packed with papers. Completely packed with papers. From ceiling to floor and wall to wall, the entirety of the space was one crammed with the prayers of believers. So densely were they stuffed into that space that they had formed a texture almost as strong as wood that they had once been made from. Dax brushed his left hand gently over the papers jutting out of the solid mass at odd angles, and another mass of them fell out onto the floor, fanning in every direction, as if they were relieved to be out of there. They were the prayers that had gone unanswered. If Dethos was a god that had been forgotten, it had obviously taken a long time for that to happen. The sound of someone clearing their throat behind him caught him so off guard that he jumped and fell against the papers, causing more of them to rain down on the floor. The light of the system disappeared and was replaced by the lantern light of a being behind him. Dax stifled a scream in his throat, knowing that would only bring more unwanted attention. He tried to shove whoever it was back, but their body was the body of a martial deity, and so he was no match for them in strength or size. But in the dim light, Dax could see that they were trying to get closer to him, but were taking extreme caution so as not to touch the piles of scattered prayers covering the floor. Only only Dethos, or deities that belong to Dethos's household, can touch his prayers. System supplied before Dax could even think about how he was going to word his question to it. There's a big taboo about it, actually, the AI finished using the tone of someone talking about celebrity gossip. The tiptoeing deity offered him a bag. Dax looked at it and started stuffing the papers into it as quickly and gently as he was able to, whilst also doing it quickly. Oh, what a sentence. Despite its small size, it held considerably more papers than you would think it would after being. It held more papers than you would think it would be able to by looking at its outer dimensions. It did not, however, weigh less than you thought it would, so Dax left it to the unknown martial god to carry it with them, as the two attempted to force the door to the prayer office closed once more. Cleaning finally completed, Dax was escorted back to his room by the stranger, who placed the odd bag in the center of the salon he was sleeping in currently. Dax laid in his nest of cushions on the floor and fell asleep almost immediately. The stranger turned to leave, but one of the scrolls had fallen out of the bag. Seconds passed by slowly as they stared at it, seeming to wrestle with themselves before they knelt down and picked it up. It unrolled. Written on it in large, looping blue letters were the words, "Please don't die," beneath which was written the signature of the god of war. Mini theatre. System. Author, are you okay? Author. No word of a lie. It took me 12 hours to edit this one chapter. It had 576 words when I first opened it. System. Maybe you should take a break? Author. I'm fine. It'll be fine. I'll edit it before NaNoWriMo 2022. Laughs. That did not happen. I finished editing this chapter on the 31st of the 7th, 2023. System. ... And unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to end stream here because my throat is really hurting. And I don't think I'll make it to the 30. But it's more for next week. Stay safe out there. Don't remember scissors. Keep those handies washed. And I'll see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. my time. And we'll do some sort of craft, which I haven't decided yet. Bye bye. Bye 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 bye. Bye bye.